Jesus, in these travels, was radically overturning cultural prejudices against various people, against women, against people of certain social status, against people who were considered worse sinners than others. Jesus was totally countercultural. Welcome back to our series from Focus on the Family Canada about our Advent devotional called An Advent Encounter. In this second of 4 videos, we're going to be looking at the next stage after he's called his disciples. And chronologically, it's a bit loose, but also there's a pattern here where Jesus travels around fairly broadly for him, and he focuses very much on people who are outcast, people who are considered less than in that culture. Women, most of all, and Samaritans, Gentiles, people who were considered ritually unclean, all of these sorts of things. And he travels far and wide to meet with some of these people. None of Jesus' travels and none of the people he met happened by accident. I think we can sometimes fall into the mistake of thinking that Jesus just kind of moved around with these 12 guys, traveled the countryside, and he'd run into someone and, oh, okay, this is an opportunity. Well, no, because Jesus, being the Son of God, who's all-knowing and who, even though he's in human form, he knows people's thoughts afar off, he knows their motives, he knows their hearts. All of these moves, all of these travels, all of these engagements with people are purposeful. Jesus orchestrated all this according to the will of his Father and led by the Holy Spirit while he was on earth, but he met with these people on purpose. Sometimes it was a single individual that he would travel a long distance, a very long distance, to bless, to heal, and to save. So we're going to look at those. The first story we want to look at is actually 2 stories together because they're intertwined and connected in Jesus' plan. And one's a small girl who's 12 years old, and the other one is a woman who's had an illness for 12 years. First, we have the story of Jairus' daughter. Jairus was a synagogue ruler, and he had a little daughter, his only child, who was deathly ill. And he sent for Jesus, pleaded with him to come and heal his daughter. And Jesus was on his way when he was delayed and interrupted. The delay cost the little girl her life. Jairus' followers, or whoever people were with him, gave him what you'd call a less than gentle, sympathetic way to break the news to him about his daughter. It was basically, your daughter is now dead. Why bother the teacher any longer? Which is awful, obviously. And then Jesus, in response to that, overhearing that, utters some of the most comforting words he ever said to this man and to all of us, which is, don't be afraid, just believe. He was telling the man to trust him. He's got this. He's got you. He's got your little girl. And Jesus goes to the house. There's all these mourners. In that culture, they had people who were professional mourners. It was very much of a ritualized thing where you'd get people, you'd hire them to come and weep and wail and play dirges on flutes and on various instruments for the dead person. So these people are all outside, probably also with neighbors, friends, and relatives. And Jesus comes in and basically says, what are you all doing? The girl is asleep. And of course, she was dead. He knew that. They knew that. He takes his 3 closest disciples, Peter, James, and John, plus the little girl's parents, Jairus and his wife, into the girl. It's just a gentle moment where he sits down beside her, takes her hand, and says to her, Talitha kum, which is Aramaic for little girl, get up. And then gives the parents instructions to give her something to eat. I mean, she's been dead. So she's going to need food and drink, water. Take care of her. It's a beautiful, gentle picture, and it's more so for the fact that he was raising her from the dead. If he had not been delayed, he would have been just healing her from her illness, which would have been wonderful in itself, but it was even more poignant and powerful and displayed his own power and his mastery, not just to heal diseases, but to raise people from the dead. We want to move on to the other story that's intertwined with this, which was what interrupted Jesus on his way over, or who interrupted Jesus. Well, there was this woman. She was Jewish. She had had a bleeding, like a hemorrhage of some sort, that had gone on for 12 years. And it says that she'd spent everything she had on doctors, physicians, different people trying to heal and cure her. And it actually says it not only didn't work, but it made her worse. Now, aside from the physical suffering, there was also the fact that as a Jewish woman, having this kind of a bleeding condition made her ritually unclean. She was basically ostracized from friends, family, the community, the worship. She couldn't go to the synagogue. She was cut off because of her what was perceived as uncleanness. So in her desperation, she basically sneaks up on Jesus in the press of the crowd and just touches the edge of his cloak and thinks to herself, if I can just do that, maybe I'll be healed. You can just sense the desperation of this poor woman who's doing this. She was probably hoping to just sneak away the way she'd come. No one would notice her. She's not supposed to be touching anybody. She's not supposed to be there. Jesus immediately goes, "Who touched me?" It wasn't that Jesus didn't know. He's looking for info. Who touched me? Who touched me? He was basically drawing her out. In fact, his disciples don't get that because they say to him, Peter and the guys go, what do you mean who touched you? Look at all these people. And he's like, no. Power went out from me, and who touched me? And he's basically looking for this woman to come forward, which she does, trembling and afraid and dropping to his feet. Like what she'd done was technically not kosher, but Jesus didn't condemn her for that. And he calls her daughter, and he says, your faith has saved you. She is healed of her bodily ailment. She's restored to society, to worship of God, to public community. This is Jesus' goodness and grace to this woman who was stepping outside of what was allowed, who was in this horrible condition, and he calls her daughter. So there's no doubt here. You are part of the family. You are accepted. You are redeemed. You are forgiven. You are healed. And these two stories, Jairus' daughter and this woman, the gospel writers point this out. They've sandwiched this story, and they mention the little girl is 12 years old, and they get onto the woman, and they say she'd been suffering for 12 years, and then we're back to the little girl. All of it according to Jesus' gracious plan. Now, after these two women that Jesus healed, Jesus travels quite a distance to make an appointment with a person. This is another woman who's got a daughter who's sick, or who in this case, I believe, is oppressed by demons. And he encounters this woman that is variously described in the different Gospels as a Canaanite, a Greek, or a Syro-Phoenician, which is a mouthful. But the whole point of those descriptions is that she was not Jewish in any sense. Obviously, she knew enough that she was coming to Jesus for help and calling him the Son of David. And Jesus, the way he dealt with her, it hits hard because Jesus first basically ignores her. She keeps asking him for mercy, and the disciples are upset, not because of how he's treating her, but because they want him to send her away. It's this Gentile woman, and she's embarrassing us. Get her out of here. And the woman keeps pleading with him, and he finally says, it's not right to throw the children's food to the dogs. So Jesus is calling her a dog. And this woman has this remarkable answer, humbly yet boldly says to him that, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs from the master's table. So she understood that the grace of God goes beyond, sure, it starts with the Jews, but it goes beyond that. It's a marvelous answer, and everything that Jesus did, this sort of tougher approach at the beginning, had that core of tenderness to it, because the whole point was to draw out this woman, draw out her faith, draw out her profession of her understanding that even though she wasn't of the people of Israel, this Messiah had grace for her. And once again, Jesus commends her faith, marvels at her faith. And we need to remember again that this wasn't an accidental meeting that caught Jesus off guard, nor was it the woman talking Jesus into something that he didn't want to do. This was Jesus' plan all along. He took this trip way outside of Judea and Galilee, a considerable distance into an area that was not Jewish at all, specifically to meet with this woman, to save her daughter, save her, bring them into the fold as Gentile converts. Jesus had friends. He had closer friends and closer friends yet. This wasn't favoritism. This is just normal human life. And even among his group of 12, there were 3 that formed sort of an inner circle of 3. That's Peter, James, and John. Jesus would bring them into special situations in his ministry that the others weren't directly privy to. He had all 12 of them, but then there were certain times when he just took these 3 and took them into a new thing that was important in his ministry. First is the transfiguration. Jesus takes the 3 guys and goes up this high mountain with them, and he's transfigured, which basically means he pulls the curtain back a little bit to show his divine glory, even though he's in a human body. Here, the description basically is just that he is glowing, that he's white, bright like sunlight, bright like snow, his clothes. Also, it says that Moses and Elijah appear to him from heaven. Moses, who of course represents the law, Elijah, the prophets, and here's Jesus. And it says they're discussing his soon departure, about when Jesus is going to die and rise. And Peter says, Lord, it's good that we're all here. Let's build 3 tents for you and Moses and Elijah. And this actually earns Peter an audible divine rebuke, not from Jesus, but from God the Father in heaven in a rumbling, thunderous voice, which is, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. At which point the disciples are terrified. They're freaked out, right? And they fall to the ground. Jesus ends the display, goes back to his regular human appearance and touches them and says, it's okay. It's over. Don't be afraid. It's all good. The other of these times when he took the three aside that's really notable is later, right before he's about to be arrested. Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane, and he is in anguish. He says, my soul is in anguish to the point of death. He is facing the reality of this horrible crucifixion, and he's praying to his Father also because he's going to endure the wrath deserving of sin for every human person. So Jesus is going to plead with his Father, if there's any way this cup of judgment can pass from me, yet nevertheless not what I will, but you will. And he's asking his three closest friends, come and be with him. Sit a distance away while he goes and prays and just be there for support. And what do Peter, James, and John do? They all fall asleep. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. This is that sense I think we can all relate to, where perhaps the people closest to us have let us down in a moment of our great need, or maybe we feel guilty because we've done that to someone who really needed us. This is a very human experience. And here's Jesus then later restoring these men to fellowship. By the time they saw the risen Lord and spent time with him, they had become bold, steady, trustworthy witnesses to Jesus and the gospel. And now we're going to track with him to Samaria. Samaria was in between Galilee to the north and Judea to the south. There was this region in between. The Samaritans were essentially a biracial people of Jews who had intermarried with other Gentile groups in the area centuries earlier, and they'd sort of worshipped the God of the Jews, but also worshipped various Canaanite and Babylonian and other deities. The Samaritans were not loved. Jews would very literally go out of their way to avoid being with Samaritans. They would not travel through Samaria. They would cross to the east over the Jordan, go down that way, go through the Gentile lands on that side, by the way, and then cross back over into Judea so that they didn't have to travel through Samaritan lands. Now, Jesus in these travels was not just about saving and redeeming certain individuals, which he was doing, but he was also about radically overturning cultural prejudices against various people, against women, against people of certain social status, against people who were considered worse sinners than others. Jesus was totally countercultural. And here he did 3 of them in this story, which is the story of the Samaritan woman by the well. Jesus comes down. It's the heat of the day. His disciples went off into the city to buy food. And he sits down next to this well where there's this woman, Samaritan woman, drawing water. The fact that she's out here by herself suggests that she was, even among the Samaritans, a social pariah, someone who avoids other people because she doesn't want their judgment on her. Jesus asks her about her husband, and she says she doesn't have one, and Jesus says, that's right, because you've had 5, and you're with another man now who's not your husband. So this woman would have been considered a sinner by even her own people. And here's Jesus going to a Samaritan, a woman who is a social outcast even among her people, and he sits down and he asks her for water. So not only talking to her, but sharing a physical vessel of food or drink, a utensil, which this would have been too much for the Jews. And as Jesus addresses her and answers her questions about all this, she basically asks about the Messiah, and Jesus tells her that the one talking to you, and she's blown away by the fact that Jesus knows all the details of her life before she said any of them. She promptly goes away, goes back into the city, starts telling them about Jesus. Come see a man who's told me all about my life. Isn't this the Messiah? Isn't this the one that's supposed to come? Breaking all these social taboos, all these prejudices and bigotries. In this short time, Jesus saved and redeemed this woman and turned her from someone who's on the outside to someone who has become essentially the first evangelist, the first spreader of the gospel among the Samaritan people. Now we want to end with the story of one of Jesus' visits to Jerusalem, where he encounters this man who's had a disability for 38 years. Jerusalem had a number of pools, and this particular pool had various people with various disabilities, illnesses, infirmities of different kinds. What they hoped to do was get into the waters of the pool at certain times, because apparently the waters would be stirred up. There were miraculous healings that took place, that whoever got into the water first would be cured of whatever was wrong with them. And this man had been lying there. It sounds like he was a man who was paralyzed. Jesus meets him there and comes up to him and says, do you want to be healed? Of course he wants to be healed. But the man says to him, how can I? I'm here and I can't ever get to the water because I can't move. By the time I get to the water, someone's beat me to it. What Jesus does is we're going to circumvent the pool stuff and all of that. Basically, he just tells him, get up, pick up your mat that you're lying on and go walk away. It's that simple. And the man in faith listens to Jesus, gets up, picks up his mat, and walks away. Now, that's not the end of the story. That's amazing. But Jesus slips away into the crowd. and then later catches up with the man in the temple. What Jesus says to him here is important because I think we often leave this part out. We look at Jesus healing people physically and how wonderful that is, which it is, but we forget the other side, the spiritual side. And Jesus says to this man, see, you are made well. See that you don't sin anymore. Jesus isn't just interested in any of these cases of healing people and showing his power. He's here to heal our souls. He's here to deliver us from our sin. He accepts us and comes to us in all our weakness, all our inability, but he doesn't leave us there. Primarily, he's about healing our hearts, bringing us from a condition of lostness and sin to a condition of being united with him and being forgiven and saved and brought into his kingdom and his family.
Discover how Jesus' disciples, skeptics, and enemies changed forever, and how Advent can change us too.